It's still the greatest insult in the House of Commons to speak of the worst Prime Minister since Lord North. He was an easy figure of caricature. He famously had these large, bulbous eyes, which the memoirist Horace Walpole said would turn around to no purpose, giving him the air of a blind trumpeter depicted on one of the classical friezes. He was, in fact, short-sighted, and there was a famous occasion in the House of Commons when he walked in carrying his sword, and the sword picked up the wig of one of the members of the House of Commons, and North didn't notice, and he continued to walk around the House of Commons with this wig on the back of his sword. He was often depicted in the satires as constantly asleep. He may even have been a narcoleptic. It was partly appearances. He had very heavy eyelids, and it gave the impression, at least, that he was asleep. But certainly during the period of the war, the demands on him were so excessive that at times he would indeed fall asleep. But this was far from an incompetent individual. He, in fact, in his youth, had been a rising star in the House of Commons. He was only 38 when he became Prime Minister in 1770. He was regarded as highly intelligent. He'd been educated at Eton and at Trinity College and Oxford University. He was a good classicist. Edward Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, dedicated 2 of the volumes of the series to Lord North, of whom he had a very high regard. He was fluent in French and conversant in German and Italian. Shortly before the Revolutionary War, he was made Chancellor of the University of Oxford. He had been a hardliner on the issue of America before he became Prime Minister. He had famously said at the time of the Townshend duties that he wanted to see America prostrate at the feet of Britain. He'd voted for the policies that helped lead to the American Revolution. He'd voted for the taxes. He'd voted for coercive policies. But interestingly enough, when he became Prime Minister, he would be much more conciliatory. He inherited a revolutionary situation in America when he became Prime Minister. The very first speech that he gave as Prime Minister in the House of Commons was the same day as the Boston Massacre, a day in which British troops fired on a crowd, killing several people, much like the Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland and the Kent State Massacre. Both sides claim that the other was guilty. The British troops claimed that they'd heard gunfire. But North inherited this situation. The policies that led to the revolution, most of them were already in place. There was already a tax on sugar and there was a tax on tea. And Lord North would keep a promise that he'd never lay an additional tax, and he never did. There were policies restraining America's Western expansion. There were restrictions on the use of paper money and what currency could be produced in the colonies. There had already been 2 major crises in which all 13 colonies had been united. These were principally caused by taxes. In 1765, the Stamp Act tax crisis, and between 1767 and 70, the Townshend revenue duties crisis. These crises had created a radical leadership that was coming to power in many of the major colonies. They'd given colonists experience of organizing revolutionary groups and of communicating with each other. They'd found ways of getting support. Most importantly, they'd already articulated the major ideas which would motivate the American Revolution. So this was the situation that Lord North inherited. But when he came to power, he did much to diffuse that situation. He succeeded 6 different governments in the 1760s, so it had been a period of real instability in English politics. And he looked to diffuse the situation in America because his primary concern was to create a stable government in Britain. And he was remarkably successful. We sometimes call this the years of quiet.